Okay, I think we will start. So thanks everybody, and welcome to this less formal part of the day where we're just going to hear from a few people as we carry on celebrating the life and work of Pit Corder. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Helen Saunson and I'm Director of the Centre for Language and Social Justice here at York St John University, and it's the research centre that's hosting this event here today. So the first person I'm going to hand over to is our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Karen Bryan.
Good afternoon everyone. The Right Honourable Lord Mayor, Lady Mayoress, Sheriff of York, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to York St John University today as we reflect and celebrate the work of Professor Stephen Pit Corder. As a dedicated Professor of Applied Linguistics, Pitt's commitment to education is echoed by our fellow linguists in the room today. And I know that yesterday's MA TESOL conference, which our students had organised, involved some very eminent applied linguists who are with us in the room today. So we're very privileged to have you here. You know who you are. And of course, it's a commitment shared by our own School of Education, Language and Psychology and reflected in the university's mission to provide educational opportunities for all. Human language brings us together, and I guess in relation to events in Ukraine this morning, perhaps language can also sometimes unfortunately divide us, but let's hope it's bringing us together. It can be the catalyst for change or the tool to find common ground. It influences the ways in which we interact with each other and think about the world around us. At York St John, the study of applied linguistics is a means of eliminating inequalities in the communities we serve. Driven by a commitment to social justice, our students and staff strive to meet these challenges with research including language policy as it relates to refugees and asylum seekers, and the experiences of deaf people working in higher education. Today, it is an honour to recognise Professor Pit Corder's link to our historic city. My thanks again to our MA TESOL and Applied Linguistics course, whose enthusiasm for their discipline and Pitt's work provides the opportunity that we have to come together today. We will continue to try to follow in Professor Pitt's footsteps, inspiring and supporting future generations of linguists who make a positive contribution to the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to echo Karen's thanks to all of you actually for being here today, and especially those of you who've travelled from outside York. We've got people here from BAAL, obviously, including the current chair and former chairs of BAAL, which is fantastic. We've also got colleagues from the University of Edinburgh, which I'm really happy to welcome here. As well, and of course Pit Corder was the first chair of applied linguistics at the University of Edinburgh. I just wanted to use this opportunity while I've got the floor just to tell you a little bit about the research centre. Applied linguistics, by its very definition, is really implicated with a social justice agenda, and actually this is why this particular event is being hosted by the Centre for Language and Social Justice work. So for those of you who aren't aware of the history of the centre, it developed partly in response to many language-related inequalities experienced by populations locally, but also around the world today as well. So Karen's mentioned some of the research that goes on. I'll just say a little bit more about some of the current projects that we've got going on. So we have our research into language and deaf communities. We also do research on language and inequalities in higher education, the very context that we all work and study in. We have research which looks at languages beyond English and issues around inclusion and language in schools. We have a body of work that looks at the effects of social evaluations of accent, dialect, multilingualism, and the different Englishes that get used in this country but also globally. We look at language, gender and sexuality related inclusion in schools and other contexts. And we look at language-based analysis of BAME communities. We look at equality, diversity and inclusion issues in language learning and teaching quite broadly, but also specifically in institutional and professional discourse as well. So even though the work we do here in York is now quite diverse, we think it is all in some way indebted to and inspired by the pioneering work of Pit Corder. So it's really fitting that we think it's a social justice and language research centre that's hosting this event in memory of him here today. So Pit Corder might not explicitly have been writing about language and social justice, but his work in many ways is actually a practice of social justice. And I never knew him, but one thing that struck me from looking at his list of publications was that he often worked and wrote collaboratively with his students and with his colleagues as well. And that's really important. Now, to me, someone who does work in looking at higher education practices in relation to language, we're living through a time when individualism is assigned an increasingly high value. What have I done? What are my achievements this year? Can you send me my ref publications? And all of this stuff that we're used to listening to, we're used to listening and engaging with. And as I was thinking about this event, it was over the New Year period. And one of the things I got really annoyed with on Twitter was academics posting what they'd done, what they'd published. Some people are nodding at this, that's good. What they'd published over the previous year, so my year's achievements. And that just sounded very individualistic to me. And it's just something that didn't really sit comfortably with me. And I don't think it would have sat comfortably with Professor Pit Corder either. So, in keeping with the spirit of Pit Corder, this Blue Plaque project has actually been genuinely collaborative. It's been very much a we project, not an I project. And of course, it's involved collaborations between students and staff. I never knew Pit Corder during his lifetime, so it does feel quite humbling for me on behalf of the Research Centre collaboratively to be hosting this event. But I do hope that the Blue Plaque on his place of birth is an appropriate way of recognising, valuing and celebrating his life and his work. So I just wanted to say thank you to all of you again for being here today. And that sort of leads me on quite nicely to hand over to the next person that would like to say something, which is Hannah, one of the students that worked on the project. So would you like to come and take the floor? Thank you.
Hello, my name's Hannah, and together with Doria Rule, who is another MA student who lives in the US, so can't be here today. I think she's probably asleep actually right now. We initially contacted York Civic Trust, so just wanted to say a few words about that. So Rachel, gave us the idea that maybe this could be something that we could work on as a group together, and Doria and I initially contacted York Civic Trust, and we also reached out to several different places to try and get some more information about Pit Corder for the Wikipedia page, and also to see if we could try and get some photographs because there weren't any. And in doing so, we reached a lot of really wonderful and helpful people. Merton College Archives, I think it was Dr. Julian Reed, gave us some information and also provided the rowing photo that's now on Wikipedia. Pittcorder in a rowing team, which is really lovely. We spoke to the University of Leeds alumni team who gave us some information. Professor John Joseph at the University of Edinburgh was extremely helpful in not only giving us suggestions of who to contact, but also providing us with some of those contact details as well. And everybody was so enthusiastic and so pleased to hear about the project. We also, sadly, Pittcorder's granddaughter Saskia passed away in 2020, but Doria actually was in contact with her before then, and she was really pleased to hear about the project. And I think she would have been really pleased today. So I thought I would just read out the email that we initially sent to York Civic Trust. Dear York Civic Trust, we are MA students of Applied Linguistics at York St John University. We're writing to suggest that a blue plaque be erected for Stephen Pittcorder, known as Pittcorder, a prominent applied linguist with a deep-rooted connection to York. We think that he's deserving of a blue plaque because he's considered the father of modern applied linguistics and was the first chairman of the British Association of Applied Linguistics, BAAL, who held their 51st annual meeting at York St John University this year, which was 2018. Corder was born at 4 Bootham Terrace on the 6th of October 1918, so this would be a fitting way to commemorate the centenary of his birth. We propose that the plaque be erected at 4 Bootham Terrace, but if permission cannot be obtained by the homeowner, Bootham School, which he attended and where his father was a master, could be considered as an alternative site. With Corder's Quaker origins and York's strong Quaker history, we feel that York would benefit from acknowledging this connection to such a well-respected academic, especially as it is the 100th anniversary of his birth this year. We hope that you consider this proposal and we look forward to hearing from you. Kind regards, Hannah Bungard and Doria Rule on behalf of the School of Languages and Linguistics at York St John University. Thank you. So we also had a lot of great information from Henry Widdowson and Tony Howitt, who were former colleagues of his at Edinburgh, and they were very, very helpful in the information that they gave to us. And we did a whole a history of Pittcorder's life, really, which is up now on the York Civic Trust website, if you'd like to read about it. And Henry Widdowson can't be here today, but he has sent some words that I'm going to read out on behalf of him. So he says, I first met Pitt in October 1964, when my arrival as a student coincided with his appointment as the new head of applied linguistics at the University of Edinburgh. The coincidence had an epiphany effect and changed the course of my life. Inspired by the example of Pitt's own acute intellectual curiosity, I was encouraged to think critically about accepted ideas. This I found so appealing that when at the end of my Edinburgh course I resumed my career at the British Council, I felt rather like the Magi, no longer at ease here in the old dispensation, and wrote to Pitt about the possibility of doing a PhD under his supervision. Not only did he accept me as a student, but also as a colleague by appointing me to a temporary post in the department, thereby providing me with the financial means for making the possibility a reality. Without Pitt's intellectual inspiration and material support, I would never have had an academic career, and whatever progress I've made in it can be traced back to the coincidence of our first meeting more than half a century ago. The blue plaque is a public recognition of Pittcorder as a distinguished scholar. My personal debt of gratitude to him is something that only I can recognise and one that I can never repay. Henry Widdowson. And Henry Widdowson was the first chair of applied linguistics at the Institute of Education at the University of London. So I think it's really lovely that everybody that we spoke to about Pittcorder had nothing but fantastic things to say about him, and he clearly moved a lot of people. So it was really a pleasure to be part of this project. And we're really happy to see that it's finally happened. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thank you, Hannah. I'd like to hand over next to Professor Zhu Hua, who's the... Yeah? Sorry, have I got that wrong?
I didn't prepare, but...
Okay, don't worry. No, it's fine. You're very welcome.
So
yeah.
you can read my mind. So as we were having lunch, I actually received an email from Professor Azra Hashem, who is president of International Association of Applied Linguistics. As I mentioned earlier, Pittcorder has served 2 terms of International Association. So she has written something, and I would like to take this opportunity to read it out. You certainly know what I'm thinking. Okay. So Pete Coulter became the second president of ILA in 1969, a testament to his stature in the association and his contribution to the discipline. He held the position for 2 terms up to 1975. His work on the new area of applied linguistics, a field of study with practical application, had a powerful impact, in particular with regard to the concept of interlanguage. The shift attention from teaching to learning and moving teaching and research on language learning and acquisition in new directions. Under his presidency, ILA, which is International Association of Applied Linguistics, began to expand beyond Europe and now has almost 40 affiliates worldwide. Today, ILA continues its work on applied linguistics in the solution of practical problems. It strives to promote interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research related to language and communication and to heighten an awareness of social issues in the field of linguistics. ILA is proud that its past president, Pete Coulter, is being recognized by the award of a blue plaque by York Civic Trust in association with York St. John University. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. I now don't trust my list of speakers, so I'm going to invite Professor Ros Mitchell, if you'd like to come and say something. Ros had a personal connection with Pete Coulter, as well as being a former chair of BAAL.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, indeed. I was lucky enough to be a student at Edinburgh from 1975 to 1976 on what had just been upgraded from a diploma programme in applied linguistics to an MSc Arts in applied linguistics. Remarkable. Of course, Pete Coulter, after, and I don't think anyone's actually mentioned this today, though I'm sure it's well known, after serving in the war, when he was, of course, a pacifist and conscientious objector as an ambulance driver, and then working internationally in a number of countries with the British Council, was appointed to develop applied linguistics in Edinburgh, as we've said, in 1964. Now, I'm sure that in his mind and in the mind of the very impressive team that he assembled, and we just heard about Henry Widdowson being one of those, that the promotion of English language teaching, the upgrading of teacher development in English language teaching, which was a definite British push at that point through the British Council and then through investment in places like Edinburgh. I'm sure that we might today see the push of English, the promotion of English, as somewhat complex and double-sided, but clearly it was seen pretty unproblematically, I think, as an expansion of education and international communication and the raising of educational standards. I think that was how it would have been read or that was certainly the atmosphere in which the course was delivered, if you like. At that point, Pitt, when I was a student, he had been there for just over 10 years. The programme was very well established. It seemed, from a student's point of view, to run extremely smoothly. They had just published their major textbook, the Edinburgh Course in Applied Linguistics, 4 volumes worth of reading, and the teaching team was extremely distinguished. Now, however, the programme was not like similar to a programme would be today. There was a very substantial content of general linguistics. We were expected to become familiar with linguistic theory, the very contemporary, the array of linguistic theories of the time, from sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, versions of grammar theory and so on. Research methods were taken very seriously, but that meant serious training in quantitative methodology and projects to do that would allow you to trial your statistical expertise. There was a course called Design Studies, in which you learnt about curriculum design and pedagogic grammar and materials development. Interestingly, there was nothing at all on pedagogy. Now the takers on the course were pretty much all of them very international, but experienced teachers already. So the course organisers could assume that the participants had brought a lot of teaching experience to test against all this theory we were getting. Now, of course, the impact of that course on me was that I ended up, in effect, although my title is Professor of Applied Linguistics, very much concerned with second language learning, second language acquisition. So what was the place of second language acquisition in that programme? Well, interestingly enough, the Edinburgh textbooks had 2 whole chapters on learning theory. There was a chapter on behaviourism, and there was a chapter on Piagetian constructivism. But when you turned up for the course, neither of those perspectives was actually mentioned in the year that I did the programme. Language learning had no separate course, in fact. Ellen Bard taught a wonderful course in psycholinguistics, extremely up-to-date, and she included some sessions on acquisition. But she was really very sceptical about notions of, grammars in the mind and things, and she was really all about processing and parsing and acquisition through language use. She surveyed and talked about the theorists of the time. She was very keen on somebody like Dan Slobin, for example, who had a kind of strategic approach to acquisition. So that was all very stimulating. And then, of course, there was Pitt's own teaching. Now, Pitt Corder taught us 3 courses. First of all, he taught us syntax, in which he dutifully toured Chomsky aspects, Chomsky syntactic structures, Michael Halliday, but it was clear that what he was actually interested in were more functional approaches to grammar, so we had a lot about case theory and things like that. Similarly, when we went to his second course, which was English grammar, it turned out not actually to be about English grammar. He announced firmly, the first sentence in my notes says, this course is going to be a notional perspective on English grammar, by which he meant starting from semantics, starting from meaning, starting from, so we talked about things like, now this does get technical, transitivity, participant roles, tense and aspect, but how do those constructs, which are basically semantic constructs, work out in English grammar? And then finally, his third course had the rather mysterious title of Descriptive and Comparative Studies. So what's that? However, when we went in on the first day, again, the first thing in my lecture notes is, next year, this course will have another name. Next year, this course will be called Interlanguage Studies. Okay, so all these ideas were kind of working their way through. And it was in this course that Pitt explained his key ideas about language learning, and also interestingly, how to research, how to study language learning. Now, Pitt himself was not at all an empirical researcher, right? Pitt was a rationalist, as Henry described him, a curiosity-driven person who liked to theorize about things. And to be honest, by this point in his career, he had really lost interest in practical aspects of language teaching, on which he had done a lot of work earlier. He was really going in the theory direction. So anyway, he explained to us his key ideas on second language learning and how to study it. Interestingly, of course, Pitt did not invent the term interlanguage, and in fact it's quite clear from his early writings that he didn't particularly like the term interlanguage at the beginning, because he felt that, well, that says you're between language A and language B, and that's not really what's going on. What's going on is, his original term was transitional competence. So there's this idea of that you start out with something simple, and then as your communicative needs develop, you elaborate the linguistic forms, the vocabulary and the grammar that you have, so that you can express more and more complicated ideas. However, he had decided by then that he had to accept the term interlanguage, and of course that's the term used in his later writings. I think the most interesting text, actually, that sums up his ideas best was a lecture he delivered to the association we've been hearing about, the International Association of Applied Linguistics. At their Stuttgart conference, he gave a talk called The Study of Interlanguage, and that's a very good summary of his ideas. So basically the idea is that the language systems we have, the languages that we use, however bizarre they may seem, are always systematic, that there's always a system there, that it changes shape as you develop, and at times it may look like a target language you're trying to learn. At other times it may look rather bizarre and strange and not like that, but that there's an underlying systematicity all the time as the system develops, and therefore when you come to the researching it, you need to study learner language as a whole, not just the wrong bits, not just the errors, but to try to get at the underlying system. Now, interestingly, he particularly argued that we should be studying informal language learners, people who are picking language up in markets or on streets or at work, which of course he will have seen masses of in his career. If you think about him working internationally, he will have known how languages are learned, in African markets or such places. So he was particularly insistent that those are the people we really ought to be studying, because that's where, in theory, you would see how a language system develops and becomes more elaborated. Now, that's something that second language learning researchers, including myself, haven't really followed. It's much easier to study people who are sitting in classrooms, but the idea was taken up, of course, by some other scholars, which I'll say a word about in a minute before I finish. The other interesting idea Pitt had, however, was that people learning a second language, if they were kind of starting out with a simple code, if you like, then was that similar to other simple codes? So how did that compare with baby talk, foreigner talk, or what linguists call pidgins, and pidgin languages, historic trade languages? And Pitt, at the time he was teaching us, Pitt was very keen on that idea, that somehow there were universals that underpinned all these kinds of language development. I mean, the basic idea was that language comes from a communicative urge, and you will develop the language system that you need to match the communicative situation that you're in, right? I've never forgotten, I didn't actually write this down at the time, but I've never forgotten the student who hadn't done the background reading, and at the end of the lecture said in a puzzled way, "Professor Corder, why are we talking about birds?" Because he really did. Corder was gracious. Anyway, so how did Pitt's influence impact? Well, clearly, Henry said it turned him into a researcher and an academic. It turned me into a researcher and an academic. They're not on the same level as Henry Widdowson. But more generally, clearly Pitt, as I've said, was not himself the person who would go out and do this empirical research. So who did? Well, in the United States, the most obvious cases are people like John Schumann, who actually finished his PhD, as I saw, in 1975, and again took up the idea of pidginization, and did study informal learners. His case study of a learner called Alberto is very well known. But also, very strikingly, in Europe, of course, this was a time of big immigration into Europe, from various parts from less well-off parts of Europe into Northern Europe, but also from immigrants from places like Turkey. And a tradition of studying adult migrants really got off the ground in the 1970s in Europe with scholars like Meisel, Dittmar, and then, of course, there was the major European Science Foundation project, which studied adult migrants, directed by Clive Perdue and Wolfgang Klein. And I would really see that project, that initiative, as the major implementer of Pitt's kind of conceptualization of starting with what's simple, trying to make sense of what people are learning in its own terms, and certainly not treating error as, target language gone wrong. So, since that time, clearly, second language acquisition research has followed many paths, and many of us don't do precisely the things that Pitt Corder recommended. But I think we can say that Pitt was clearly, a founder in this discipline, in this strand of research, whose memory I'm delighted we are commemorating today, and to whom we will owe, I think, continuing inspiration and respect. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ros. Really fascinating to hear more about Pitt's research, but also his teaching as well. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to invite Professor John Joseph from University of Edinburgh. Thank you.
Rawls is a hard act to follow. I'm just going to make a couple of points, but when I get back to Edinburgh, I'm going to be very nice to my students, because I've realized that 50 years from now, one of them is going to be, reminiscing. I am the third professor of applied linguistics at the University of Edinburgh, and the first non-Quaker. This is part of our equality and inclusion drive. I wondered, at some point I started to wonder, why is it? Was it a coincidence that both Pitt Corder and Alan Davis, who succeeded him, were members of the Religious Society of Friends, as it's properly known? And I don't think that it's a coincidence, because since its founding, George Fox, who founded the Religious Society of Friends, was very concerned about language and saw language as a problem in terms of social equality. So that's why, the thee and thou are the original singular pronouns in English. You was originally plural, like vous in French and tu. And it just became the fashion to call everybody vous, everybody by the plural. And George Fox said, no, it's a lie. It's not true. It's one person, call them thou and thee. And friends, why friends? Well, Mr., if you call someone Mr. Or Mrs., this is a form of the word master. And you're saying that this person has a mastery over you that they don't have. So we're just going to say friend to everyone, even the Lord Mayor and Lady Mayoress. And you couldn't say good day, because all days are equally good. That level of intense worry about language. I imagine that people who grew up in the milieu that Pitt Corder grew up in could not have escaped that, could not have failed to imbibe that and be shaped by it. And Helen mentioned his generosity to his students, and Rawls mentioned the concept of interlanguage, and those two things go together as well, because most people associate interlanguage, I think, is Pitt Corder's single most famous, single greatest contribution to applied linguistics. But it's more associated with one of his students, Larry Selinker, who first published an article in the journal Language entitled Interlanguage. But Larry Selinker is very clear. He said, I did not make up that term. Pitt Corder did. And he gave it to me. He said, you take it, you publish it. I understand a bit better now maybe why he did, because, as you say, he had some qualms about it. But that was his generosity, that level of generosity. And it is about accepting different ways that people speak, not correcting students, but figuring that the mistakes that people make in speaking a second language, if they're problematic, it's going to come to people's attention. They're going to find a way of working it out. It will work itself out. Don't fuss over it, and let people develop fluency. Let them develop a level of comfort in speaking that second language. That's what will really lead to that sort of social leveling, that so it won't be the case that only the people who go to the very best schools will speak wonderful English and all the rest will not be able to, because that's what was happening. They recognized that English was becoming the international language in the 1960s and 70s. They knew that there's nothing they could do that could either slow that down or speed it up. But they said, if that's what's happening, let's make the teaching and learning of English as good as we can, so that it will benefit everyone and will lead to that sort of social justice that the center is devoted to. So it's an honor to have been able to address all of you in the memory of a wonderful scholar and human being, Stephen Pitt Corder. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. In the Quaker tradition, would anybody else like to say anything? We've reached the end of our scheduled speakers, but if anybody else would like to contribute anything, you're very, very welcome to. Otherwise, we can enjoy the rest of the afternoon. And I will just thank you again for coming. We really appreciate it, and it's been a really lovely day. So thank you again, everybody.